Okay, here we go. Just to point out that Rabbi Silberstein is the rabbi of Cornell University. He's a shaliach of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He's been there for, 32 years, I think, maybe more than 32 years. I think 32 years. And not only is he a shaliach at that particular venue at Cornell University, but he also happens to be a lecturer. And certainly, as far as I'm aware, the real life force of the campus. Without further ado, I would like to invite Rabbi Silberstein to join up and go ahead. Let's see now. Your microphone seems to be not working. 1 second. Here we go. There we go. Okay. Rabbi Silberstein, you can hear? Not coming through. 1 second. Unmute. I did that. Unmute. Make the host. Just 1 second, Rabbi Silberstein. For some reason, I can't get your mic working here. Is your mic on? It's not working. Oh, there we go.
Okay, are we on?
Yeah. Now you're on.
All right. Thank you, Rabbi Miller, for including me this.
Let me just point out to everybody, I'm really sorry, I should have mentioned this before. I called Rabbi Silberstein about a half hour before we started because the Rabbi Pinson was not able to make it tonight. And Rabbi Silberstein very, very graciously agreed to jump in with literally a half hour's notice, and he had a class that he had to give as well. So we really appreciate it, Rabbi Silberstein. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Okay, so I had a few minutes to think what I can share with you that has not been said. And what came to my mind is an important teaching about the legacy of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai lived at a time when there were many great scholars, Talmudic sages. He lived right after the destruction of the Second Temple. And the Talmud was written at that time. That's when it took shape. And there were many great people, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was unique, as he is in a unique class of sages. And let me try to explain something that we learn and glean from the Alter Rebbe's, the first Chabad Rebbe's teachings. There is a verse from the prophet Micha that says the following. It talks about the future of the coming of Mashiach and talks about how the dynasty of the family of David will take over the leadership of the Jewish people and usher in a new era of wisdom, enlightenment, and peace and harmony. And the verse goes something like this. At that time, when peace will prevail permanently, be an everlasting peace. If Ashur ki yiva'enu, when the Assyrians will try to come upon us like they did in the past, where they led to the destruction of the first temple, and they conquered Israel and exiled the Jews, the 10 tribes particularly. If Ashur were to come to attack us, God says, I will give you 7 shepherds, Shiva Roim, Ushmona Nesicha Adam, and 8 princes of men. Very strange, enigmatic language. But as is explained, it's fascinating that in Judaism we have 2 types of great, holy, righteous people that had great influence, exercised enormous influence on the lives of Jewish people. One class of great people is referred to as shepherds, and the other class called princes of men. Shepherds, let's look at the word shepherd. A shepherd is someone who feeds his flock and nurtures their physical health. This is a reference to great sages who were great teachers. They nurtured our thinking. They provided us with wisdom. They guided us. They inspired us through their learning and teaching. They were great shepherds, teachers. Shepherds means teachers. Then there were those righteous and great souls, if you will, sages, whose main influence was not through teaching. In fact, we find almost nothing that they taught in the Talmud other than miracle stories that the Talmud tells about them, like Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, who's buried in Tzfat. If you go to Tzfat, all the way at the bottom of the cemetery where the Arizal is buried, you'll see Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair. Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, there's no halachic teaching mentioned anywhere in the Talmud in his name. The only mention of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair is in the context of miracles. He was a holy man. He was a powerful spiritual giant. The great acts of kindness he was involved in, but no halachic teachings. Then we have Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, who was also a great sage, but we find very little intellectual teachings in his name. These are called princes of men because they were like princes. You know, a prince is someone you're in their presence and you're in awe. You know, royalty. But there's no direct engagement of fostering consciousness, understanding. We're inspired by osmosis, being in the presence of somebody really great, intensely spiritually phenomenal, gives us a very powerful, you can say, a jolt, spiritual jolt. We feel like in awe. We don't know why. We don't know exactly what goes through the minds of these great spiritual giants because they live in a world of mystery, but we know they're really great and really lofty. These are people that have very little vulnerabilities related to the material and mundane world. These are people that are preoccupied, consumed with their relationship with God every moment. And so these two categories of sages, the princes of men and the shepherds, represent completely different sources of influence in the Jewish community. And the Alter Rebbe explains that with this, we can understand a very interesting story of that transpired between Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the greatest Talmudic teachers. He was sort of the dean of the Rabbinical Academy of the you can say the equivalent of the Sanhedrin of the time, a great teacher indeed, and Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, who was a younger student of his. The story is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had a son who fell very ill, dangerously ill. He was literally in a fatal state, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai turned to this young student of his, Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. Again, we don't know anything about his scholarship. There's nothing mentioned in the Talmud ever about what he had to say about any halachic decisions, but he was a great miracle worker. Okay, you see stories in the Talmud how he prayed for the sick, and he would say, "This person will live, this person will die." He was a godly man, a heavenly man. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the great illustrious teacher, the leader of the Jewish people of the time, turns to his younger student Hanina and says, "Hanina, please, my son Hanina, can you pray for my son?" Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's wife was slightly taken aback and said to her husband, "I mean, turning to this young student to pray for you? I mean, you are the leader of the Jewish people." And he says, "My relationship with God and his are very different." And he used language, he compared himself to a minister in the royal court, and Hanina ben Dosa is like this servant. The servant has always access to the king's inner chamber because he cleans up and he takes care of the king, whereas the minister can only go in certain times when the king summons him into a private meeting to discuss important issues related to the country. Anyways, the point that the Rebbe makes there is that these Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai does represent very different categories of leadership, and Rabbi Mendoza was more of a saint. His mode of communication and leadership of the Jewish people was not through teaching; it was through by example. The way he prayed, the way he served God, people being in his presence were deeply touched and inspired and moved to change, not by virtue of anything that he taught them, not because they expanded their understanding and their appreciation for a certain piece of knowledge. It's mostly because they saw this incredible source of light that was so transcendent, beyond anything they could really explain, but they felt deeply moved. And he calls it makif. It's like a king who is removed from the people. Just his mere presence inspires awe. And then he says, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was a teacher. And he says, those who were shepherds and teachers, to some degree, had to sacrifice some of the great potential of spiritual accomplishments that they could have accomplished for themselves, because they were engaged in teaching the people and fostering knowledge. They went down to the people. This inevitably costs the leader a certain degree of his potential self-perfection, self-achievement. And he says, to some degree, their access to God is not as complete as those who remain closed in their own esoteric world and don't know teaching. They're not involved with the people. They remain sort of closed in their own mysterious world. He calls them fish. There's two types in the Zohar. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai teaches two types of tzaddikim, those who are compared to marine life. They're like fish in the water. They're never seen. We don't know. We don't understand. We know that these people are engaged in a very esoteric world of deep spiritual communication with God, but we don't have access to their minds because they're so lofty and so transcendent. But just by being around them, we're inspired in a more superficial way, transcendent way. But then there are those who are called shorabar. They're like animals on dry land. They walk amongst us people. These are the tzaddikim, the leaders that come down to the level of the people, teaching them and fostering their thinking. So these are the two types of great leaders. And now Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, as we see in many ways, was a synthesis of both. You could say he was a shepherd and a prince. Because on the one hand, he's the author of the Zohar. He really introduced the Jewish people to the most esoteric resource of consciousness and wisdom. But at the same time, he's one of the most prolific halachic scholars in Judaism. So much so that the Alter Rebbe claims there's not a single chapter in the Talmud where his name is not mentioned and associated with a halachic decision, something which cannot be said about any other sage of his time. So he was, on the one hand, a very practical teacher, taught halacha, and had opinions about every aspect and every facet of Jewish life. And at the same time, was one of the most esoteric teachers and you can say leaders who brought the deepest world of spirituality to the common man. This synthesis of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai being on the one hand extremely lofty and transcendent, in touch with a world that is beyond, and at the same time being able to come down to the people, is not merely an expression of his duality. You could say he was a man of many traits or many facets. That's not the way he saw it. And the Rebbe in his teachings brings this many times, that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai saw these two worlds: the esoteric, the marine, the world of the marine, the hidden world, the world of Kabbalah, of the esoteric wisdom, of mysticism, and at the same time the practical Jewish life, everyday life. He saw them as one organic body of living. And he himself, the Rabbi Shimon, compared that to a living body, a body and a soul. We know that a living human being is really, in essence, a composite of two completely distinct and opposite entities. A soul, which is a spiritual entity that is governed by properties that have nothing to do with the physical world, and a body, which is strictly and purely physical, governed by space and time and all other kinds of scientific and biological conditions. And these are they have nothing in common. Yet God, in his infinite ability, has fused these two entities, completely incompatible entities, and fused them, not just made them work in tandem with each other as partners, but they became, God fused them together in such a way they became an organic unit, where when you look at a person's face and you see their skin, you're not looking at the skin, you're looking at the person. The skin and the person, it's all the same, because the body is so transparent to the inner soul. This is one of the most unique expressions of one of the greatest miracles that God shared with us. He shares with us on a daily basis, the human being, a synthesis between two completely opposite forces and entities that the most unlikely partners become not just partners, but they become one. And when you look at a person, you see a living human being, so much so that you have, here near Cornell University, you have professors who will say, there is no soul. Hey, look, it's just a human being, right? It's an organism. It's so deceptive as God managed to fuse this union between body and soul that some may deny that there is such a thing as a soul separate from the body. And yet, and this is what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai saw as a perfect analogy for these two dimensions in Judaism, the esoteric, right, the hidden world of Judaism, and the practical halacha, that they cannot be separated. And one of the great gifts that the Lubavitcher Rebbe gave us is demonstrating this in so many ways in halacha. It's one of my favorite topics that I've been busying myself in the last 32 years here on this campus, is trying to show people the unique nature of Jewish law, even areas of law and practice which we have in common with other people. I mean, the legal system in Judaism, in the Talmud, many aspects of that system are very much overlap with secular systems, dealing with contracts, money, marriage, divorce, all of these issues that are very much part of everyday the human condition is part of Judaism, and that's why it's not surprising Supreme Court justices often cite the Talmud, right? And they'll cite an interesting nuance in Talmudic thinking related to some secular law. Yet, when you really analyze and scrutinize some of those nuances that deal with money and property, you notice that there is something unusual about that system. And this is where the Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, give us the great gift of being able to see the deepest spiritual expression of the divine in the most mundane discussions of law, dealing with money, property, litigation, right? Contentious disagreements in a courtroom, that there is deep spirituality in that. And let me just give you one application which I think is very relevant to most of us here and is extremely contemporary. In other words, the legacy of Shimon Bar Yochai in this regard, in the regard of bringing together the mundane level of Torah, of Judaism, dealing with mundane issues, and the most esoteric ideas related to God and the inner dimension of the world, that bringing them together as one, like a body and a soul, has potential of transforming our lives in such an amazing way. It can solve many issues, many problems. I know we have people in this staff that are going to speak tonight that are coaches and counselors in this area, but I'm none of that. But I can just share with you something that I have learned and that I think can have great impact on all of us, all of our lives, especially those of us who are divide our time between two worlds, the Jewish world, the synagogue, the time when you spend praying or studying Torah, doing mitzvahs, communicating with God. And then there's a part of you that's just is out there hustling, making a living. For some people, it's actually a recreational experience, making money. How can I make another buck, right? And it's not even a matter of desperately needing some resources to survive. Some people have plenty of resources, but it's the joy of being able to engage in this whole process of wheeling and dealing and making money. It's a real part of people's lives. For most people, this becomes like a little bit of a tension and a conflict, because you're dealing with completely two separate worlds of experiences. And where one, you're the same human being, and one moment you're trying to fully engage in a spiritual involvement and communication with God, and then there is, you immediately have to transition, right? Going from shul and davening and trying to experience God in a very central way, realizing that God is the center of everything in your life and in the world around you. But at the same time, you have to then throw yourself into a world where, everything is very different. The environment is very different. The feeling is so different. And the culture is very much one where, me versus everybody else. How am I going to manage to outsmart the next guy in a good deal and making money? So these are very different worlds, and sometimes they can cause tremendous tension and stress within us. So here's one of the great teachings of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that these are not separate worlds, and if we relegate them to separate realms, then we are bound to feel tremendous stress as a result. But for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the gift that he gave us is to understand what wealth means. Jews were never shy with wealth, as we all know. We didn't run away from money, right? We didn't believe that a good spiritual life means rejecting wealth. Some of the greatest people in our tradition were extremely wealthy. Rebbe, who wrote the Talmud, was the wealthiest man in the Middle East. According to the Talmud, he was wealthier than the Roman emperor. He was massively wealthy. Wealth is a blessing. It's a divine blessing, according to Judaism. It's not something we shun from a spiritual perspective. On the contrary. As I said, some of the greatest, most sacred individuals in our tradition have been extremely wealthy, and they did not run away from it. On the contrary. The difference is how we perceive wealth. And this is one of the great teachings of Kabbalah, is that everything in the physical world has a divine spark, has something divine in it, a divine value, if you will. So, and this is true for anything, a grain of sand to the most spectacular galaxy, okay? Everything has in it a divine energy or light, if you will, that sustains its existence every moment. And then Kabbalah teaches us how we were allocated a certain amount of property because our souls that migrated from the highest and loftiest realms in the heavens to come here on earth, to come in contact with those sparks that are lost in a way and trapped, right, in these endless physical things that exist in the world around us. And by owning things, becoming the proprietor of a certain segment of the world, that means owning property, owning wealth, owning money, by engaging in the world, we are actually connecting with those sparks. And it is our mission to engage in utilizing those physical entities that God has blessed us with and sent into our domain of ownership, and use them for a holy purpose, because by doing that, we're stirring up these godly entities and sparks that are embedded within the physical world and that have been allocated to us. We're freeing them up, allowing them to express themselves within the physical world more freely, which in turn turns the world into a more divine place. This is in a nutshell how Kabbalah explains the meaning of wealth, of ownership, And that's why when you look in the Torah, you see all kinds of expressions about ownership and the association of ownership with spirituality. For example, when Avraham Avinu bought the famous cave of the Machpelah to bury his wife Sarah, the Torah uses language which is extremely enigmatic. The Torah is attempting to describe how Avraham took possession of that field, and then uses the word, instead of using the word Vayiken or Kana Avraham, he took possession in a which is a financial term. The Torah uses Vayakam, that the field rose to Abraham. And Rashi immediately comments. It's a very strange employment of language to describe a financial transaction. And Rashi says, no. You have to understand that when Avraham bought this field, through this financial transaction, something transpired spiritually between Avraham and that field. Something objectively changed in that relationship. That field rose in spiritual value. It rose to Avraham. Something, right? Just like we have souls, that field has a soul. Everything around us has a spiritual component that you may call a spark or a soul that is related to our souls. When we came into the world, it was preordained which things we will end up owning because our souls were preordained to come in contact with those sparks and elevate them. That's why the Gemara says, not only is it Bashert, who you will marry, but it's also Bashert, which field you will own. Famous statement in the Gemara in Sota Daf Beis, that it's preordained 40 days before birth who this person will marry, who the soulmate of that person will be, and then the Gemara continues. I mean, our grandmothers told us about Bashert, that you should always find your Bashert, because they knew about that part of the statement. They never told you the second part of the statement, which is the Talmud continues and said it is also preordained, likewise, which field, which house, which chair, which window will be yours. In other words, there could be two windows, look identical, same price, look exactly the same, but that window was meant to be yours, the other one was not meant to be yours. You walk into a furniture store, you buy yourself a dining room set, and they're two identical looking Italian dining room sets. They cost both $10,000, made by the same manufacturer. They look absolutely impeccably the same, and yet you choose one and not the other because that one was meant to be yours. And when your builder and contractor goes and builds you a dream house, and he walks into a Home Depot to get 10,000 bricks to build you a house, there are 100,000 bricks on the shelf. He chooses 10,000. He seemingly randomly says the Gemara. This is not the Kabbalah. This is not in the Zohar. This is in the Gemara. But it says that he actually chose the 10,000 that was meant to be yours. It was preordained that those bricks have to be in your house because there's something about those bricks. Those bricks contain within them a spark that is related to your soul, and because of that, you have to own them. In other words, ownership is a reflection of a deeper bond that exists between the soul of the proprietor and his property. That's a deep spiritual teaching that sheds so much light on so many laws. If you open up the Talmud, a Jewish law dealing with financial transactions, you'll uncover that there are so many interesting laws that are so different than any other legal system. They cannot be explained on the basis of basic logical human reasoning and common sense. There is something more to those laws. They betray a certain kind of esoteric nature. And I can give you numerous examples in the Talmud. I'll give you just one example. Now that we discuss ownership, that ownership is more than just a convention that society created, not just an artificial convention in order to facilitate law and order, or as some of the philosophers of law explain, it's also meant to spur some creativity. If we didn't have ownership rights, people would not be motivated to create, right? If Bill Gates couldn't recover the profits of Microsoft, we would still be writing with quills on parchment today, because who would want to create new technology if they didn't have an incentive? So yes, that's the common understanding. Aristotle, they all speak about the concept of ownership as an artificial convention. It's a convention. There's nothing really going on between me and the computer that I'm sitting in front of, because it could be somebody else. I mean, I can give it away. It's just an object, right? But Kabbalah says not so. The fact that by divine providence you own this means there's something about this computer, objectively, something in that computer. There's a spiritual dimension there that is related to your neshama. That's why by divine providence you will own it, and therefore you have a spiritual responsibility towards that computer. It changes the whole game of the relationship between you and property. It's a spiritual one, not a materialistic one. Now, interesting law. Many rabbis have probably told you that before Pesach you got to sell your chametz, because there's a law in Judaism that says you must not own any chametz. Again, the law is not about possession. You know, we have laws in American or any other legal system against possession of certain elements. You can't possess drugs. You can't, if you have missiles in your backyard, nuclear missiles, they'll arrest you, because the idea there is possession. They don't want you to have physical proximity and access to harmful stuff. But there's no law anywhere about legal title of ownership. Because why would any legal system care about whether I have this academic relationship with property, which it's just a fiction, right? There's no real relationship there. Why would there be a law even addressing such a relationship? But in Judaism we do. Pesach, you cannot own. If you own chametz on Pesach, and you don't have to dispossess it, you don't have to ship it to Alaska on a UPS truck. You can leave it. I have chametz in my kitchen, but boarded up, but it's sold. I don't own it. Somebody downstate who has never seen my house legally owns, and that's okay. That satisfies the concern of the Torah. What a law. Interesting law. Then we have Sukkot, another law that if you want to fulfill the mitzvah of shaking the lulav in the etrog, you actually have to own the lulav on the first day. If you don't legally own it, not just hold it in your hands, you have to be by law, you have to have the legal title of ownership of these four species in order to satisfy the mitzvah of shaking the lulav in the etrog. What an interesting law. Now, what's strange about this is, because what is a mitzvah? A mitzvah is really a connection, right? So it's a bond between you and God. Why would an artificial condition, ownership or not ownership, if it's only an artificial function, right? It's a convention that has no real meaning. It's just we created for utility. It has only utilitarian value. Why would that make or break the connection? In what way would it have any? Why would it play any role in the relationship? Okay, but with Pesach, a professor asked me this question. This is what made me think about it. A professor I was teaching here at the government department asked me a very interesting question. He said, I don't understand. The Torah doesn't want you to own bread on Passover, but the Torah is the legal system that tells you that you're the legal owner. So why doesn't one law talk to the other and says you don't own it and finish? I mean, what's this thing? No, the law says we declare you the owner. And the other law says we don't like the fact that you're the owner, and therefore we're going to punish you. Not literally, but so what's going on? What kind of a legal system is this? This is an eye-opener, because what it tells you, that ownership is more than just a convention. It's more than just a utilitarian idea, as conventional wisdom tells us. Kabbalah tells us there's actually a reality behind ownership. Ownership is real. When we own things, it's because there's a relationship, an objective relationship between us and the property we end up owning. It's not by coincidence. We had to own those things. There's a spiritual bond there, and that's where ownership is a reflection of that. And therefore, when you own bread on Passover, the law didn't create that convention. This is real. You really have a relationship with it. And the only way to satisfy the law not to own it is for you to put an end to that relationship by selling it. Just like the law may not like that you murder somebody, but if you did murder somebody, the law will say, hey, we don't like that, therefore he's not dead. Nobody would say that. Life and death is a biological reality. You can't change it. The law just says, we don't want you to create this reality, and if you do, we'll step in and punish you. but we can't change it. It's just because we don't like it, much to our dismay, he's there. He's room temperature. But the same thing is with ownership. Ownership is a reality. The law didn't create it. The law responds to it. It says, you are the owner, and therefore you need to do something about it. You guys understand? There's many, many other laws, and we go on for hours and hours and hours, giving you interesting ideas in Jewish law dealing with property and money that really reflect this unique esoteric nature of the relationship between property. This is just one example, but what it really, really does to us, I don't want to overstep my time, I'm going to finish with that, is that when you go into the office and write checks and wheel and deal on the phone, if you don't have the same mindset you have in shul when you daven and speak to God, then you're missing out. You're really missing out on something really valuable. What Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai taught us, there are no two worlds in our lives. There's only one world. The world that connects us with God, either through prayer or through property. And when we deal and wheel, we do it honestly. Torah gives us guidance how to engage in the world and how to fulfill our mission in the world. Just leave you with a story that the Rebbe once told about the fourth Lubavitcher Rebbe. Rabbi Shmuel, the Marash, was also a wealthy man, but in very unusual ways. He was he dealt with stocks. The Russian Wall Street at that time was in Petersburg, right? Petersburg, and he would send from this little town, little bump on the road somewhere in Belarus, which was weeks away of traveling from the capital of Russia, from Petersburg. He would send these letters to an agent that he had, that he engaged in his business to buy or sell these stocks and those. That's how he did business. Now, to get the message to his agent took 2 weeks because there was no internet in those days. There was no telephones, and the whole of Lubavitch, the town of Lubavitch, was just like a little bump on the road with mud all. I mean, they didn't have regular roads. They had just muddy little roads with goats running around. And so to get a train, you had to go to another town even to get a train. So for him to send a letter to his agent took about 2 weeks before the agent got the letter. Like, can you imagine doing business in this kind of environment where you send a letter to your agent, it takes 2 weeks to get to him. Can you please sell those stocks and buy the other ones? By the time the letter gets there, it's way too late. Nobody in his right mind today would expect to make any money. If anything, you're going to go down deep. Forget about it, right? But this Rebbe did business and became extremely wealthy. And nobody knows how. There were no newspapers in Lubavitch. It's not like he read the newspapers or went on the internet to see and read up on the recent stocks. He did business he learned Torah, davened, and guided people. And then he sent letters. Those are the stocks you should sell. Everybody knew there was something more than just a nice, clever, savvy businessman making money. One day, his agent, this is the story that the Rebbe told, his agent saw a great opportunity to buy a stock, but he realized he was not like the Rebbe. He understood the lapse of time can be detrimental. So he understood that if he waited for the Rebbe to respond and give his consent to buy that stock from the Rebbe's money, it would be too late. I mean, the opportunity, time was of essence. So he went and took money out of the Rebbe's account and bought the stock without consulting the Rebbe because it would take too long. And then of course he took it at his own risk. And if he was wrong in his assessment and lost money in this deal, he would have paid back from his own money. But he was so sure that this is a golden opportunity, and he indeed made a lot of money. Right? He was right. And then he sent a letter to the Rebbe Marash announcing gleefully, I made you a lot of money, and I'm sorry I didn't consult you. I did it at my own risk, but I took money because I knew time was of essence. But don't worry, I would not do this unless it's at my own risk. But thank God I made you a lot of money, and I just want you to know that. And he gets a letter back, and the Marash saying, the money that you made from this transaction doesn't really belong to me. You should take it out of my account. You can take it for yourself. It has no connection to me. You understand how these people did business. For them, these were deep spiritual connections in the world that they saw through the lens of business. Understand? This is one of the great teachings of Rashbi, is to see a seamless connection between heaven and earth. And therefore, it's not surprising that when Rashbi saw there was no rain in Israel, instead of doing what everybody else would do, the greatest tzaddikim, the greatest rabbis, what they would do is to pray. Hey, right? If you need something, you ask. Please give it to me. But he did something completely illogical. He started teaching a piece of Torah. And you would think it's something to do with rain. Nothing to do with rain. Something to do about how pleasant and how beautiful it is to be like brothers together. What does that have to do with rain? And he spoke about it. He gave a deep teaching on this verse, and rain started gushing down like crazy. Now, Hasidus explains the deep spiritual connection between his teaching on that verse and the meaning of rain. But it's symbolic of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's legacy. That to him, the world, the spiritual, esoteric world of the inner dimension of Torah, and the physical, natural world, there was no. It was a seamless bond. There was no. They were totally transparent to each other. So, somebody just sent me in a WhatsApp message today that there is a sefer by a great tzaddik, Pinchas of Koretz, who was one of the great disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, that he writes in his sefer that if you go outside between Pesach and Shavuos and there's rain, you should actually not run away, but you should actually embrace it. He said because he brings from the Zohar, from Shimon Bar Yochai, that between Pesach and Shavuos, when there's rain, it's a rain of chesed, and he says you should move a little bit your head so the rain can pour on you. He even says you open your mouth and drink some of that rain, because he says there's something spiritual about rain during that season. And then he says after Shavuos, it depends when the rain falls, etc., etc. The idea is that these people, when they looked at the natural world, rain, grain, fruit, food, whatever it was, they didn't see them as two separate realms. They saw them as one world, body and soul coming together. Living that kind of a life really brings harmony within our own lives, and makes, it has tremendous benefits and blessings. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for listening and for the free associations that I shared with you in the last hour. I'm sorry I didn't have anything prepared. I just, what do you call it? A consciousness, something of consciousness, whatever that's called. May God bless us all, that the merit of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who said himself that he can protect the world with his merit. He said his merit is so great, he could save the world. May he fulfill that promise today. We need it more than ever, and bring Mashiach Tzidkenu.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi Eli. It was fantastic. I really appreciate it. Just as an aside, the first thing that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai did when he came here, he was hiding away from the Romans for 13 years, 12 years, and then they went back for another year into the cave. The first thing that when he came out of the cave, that he did was ask, does anything around here need fixing? Does anything need fixing? And he meant in a spiritual sense. And I told him there was a place that certain people couldn't walk through, Kohanim, priests couldn't walk through that area because it was tameh, it was impure, and they didn't know exactly where the impurities were, so they had to go a very long way around. And he marked out, he was able to recognize and understand and feel where those graves were, and he could mark them out, and then people were able to go the shorter way around. Again, it's the same idea of fixing up what's around us and not sort of running away and staying in your cave, so to speak, for the rest of your spiritual existence and physical existence in the world. So we appreciate very, very much, and especially jumping in at the last minute to give us a really wonderful insight into the amalgamation of two dimensions of being, two dimensions, two types of souls, two types of people, two types of tzaddikim, and the two aspects of Torah and soul and life and so on altogether. Very much appreciated. I'm just going to stop recording.